So when you got up yesterday morning, what time was it?
Like 10.
And you had to be there at 11. You clocked in at 11:02,
So yeah,
right?
I woke up at 10. Yeah.
And the girls were not home.
A home is supposed to be the safest place in the world, the one place where you never expect betrayal, violence, or death to walk through the door. But sometimes the person you trust the most becomes the very one you should fear. In quiet towns and seemingly perfect marriages, dark secrets can grow silently, until they explode in ways no one sees coming. Tonight's story isn't just about jealousy, rage, or greed. It's about how ordinary lives can spiral into horrifying crimes. From a soldier trapped in an abusive marriage, to a wealthy widow obsessed with control, to a woman whose envy turned into pure evil. These chilling cases prove one disturbing truth. Monsters don't always look like monsters. At first glance, Greg Whitmore seemed like a man who had everything going right in life. He was a soldier who had survived the brutal realities of the First Gulf War and returned home determined to build the peaceful family life he had dreamed about while overseas. Friends described him as easygoing, patient, and deeply devoted to his children. When he married his longtime sweetheart, Shayna Parkinson, it looked like the beginning of a happy chapter. The couple eventually welcomed 2 children, a son and a daughter, and from the outside their life appeared normal, almost ideal. But behind closed doors, something was very wrong. Shayna's personality could shift without warning. What began as small arguments slowly turned into something darker. Her moods became unpredictable, explosive, and often violent. Those who later studied her behavior believe she may have been suffering from multiple untreated mental disorders. Instead of seeking professional help, she began to self-medicate in dangerous ways. Alcohol became a constant companion, and she often abused prescription medications she didn't legally obtain. The combination was disastrous. Alcohol and sedatives can intensify emotional instability, and in Shanna's case, they seemed to amplify her worst impulses. Her temper became uncontrollable, and there was one person who absorbed the full force of her rage: Greg. The abuse wasn't occasional. It was repeated and escalating. Shanna lashed out physically, sometimes attacking Greg during arguments that started over the smallest issues. No matter what Greg tried to do, nothing seemed to calm her anger. Friends would later say something heartbreaking about Greg. He endured the abuse quietly. Part of the reason was embarrassment. Society often expects men to be the protectors, not the victims. Greg worried that if he told anyone the truth, they might laugh, dismiss him, or assume he must have provoked the violence. To many people, the idea of a man being abused by his wife simply didn't fit the usual narrative. But the violence kept getting worse. Eventually, Greg began opening up to a few close friends. He admitted the situation at home had become unbearable. He felt trapped. If he defended himself, people might see him as the aggressor. If he stayed silent, the abuse continued. By 2002, the man who had bravely faced combat in the Gulf War realized he could no longer survive the war inside his own home. He made the difficult decision to leave. Greg moved out, hoping that distance would finally end the chaos and allow him to rebuild his life. But for Shayna, the separation wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. For nearly a decade, she had dominated the relationship, and Greg walking away shattered that control. Her anger quickly turned into obsession. When the divorce was finalized in 2003, Greg tried to move forward. He eventually began a new relationship with a woman named Karen Cummings, a 29-year-old who friends described as kind and supportive. For the first time in years, Greg seemed hopeful again, but Shayna was watching. The moment she learned about Karen, her behavior became even more extreme. Jealousy consumed her. She began stalking Greg relentlessly, calling him over and over again, sometimes hundreds of times a day. It didn't matter where he was or what he was doing. The calls kept coming. If the phone didn't reach him, she showed up in person. Shayna would appear outside Greg's home, screaming, pounding on doors, creating scenes that frightened everyone around them. Her temper, already volatile, became even more dangerous. Those who witnessed her behavior described it as unpredictable and bizarre, as though she had completely lost control of her emotions. Greg tried to focus on protecting the one thing that mattered most to him, his children. Because the children were still living with Shayna, Greg's worries never really stopped. Every day he wondered what kind of environment they were growing up in. Shayna's behavior had become increasingly unstable, and the combination of heavy drinking and prescription drug abuse only made things more dangerous. Greg knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. If something went terribly wrong, his children could be the ones caught in the middle, so he decided to take action. Greg began pursuing custody, hoping the court would allow the kids to live with him instead. To him, it wasn't about winning a battle against his ex-wife, it was about protecting his family. But the moment Shayna realized what he was trying to do, Her anger exploded. For Shayna, Greg's decision felt like betrayal. Her rage quickly turned into something darker and more personal. In a disturbing act that shocked everyone who later heard about it, Shayna broke into Greg's home while he was away. She didn't steal money or valuables. Instead, she went straight for the items that held the most emotional value to him. She gathered his belongings, personal items, trophies he had earned, and even a cherished photograph of his mother. Then she burned them. To investigators, this wasn't just vandalism, it was a symbolic act of destruction. By burning the things Greg cared about most, Shayna was sending a message. It was as if she was trying to erase him completely, piece by piece, from her life. By this point, the conflict between them had already reached a dangerous level. Their relationship had moved far beyond arguments or legal disputes. Something far more volatile was building beneath the surface, and soon, that tension would explode. Just days later, on February 1st, 2004, Shayna appeared at Greg's home again. But this time, the confrontation would not end with shouting, threats, or damaged property. It would end in blood. Shayna arrived at Greg's home unannounced that day, her emotions already spiraling out of control. Years of anger, jealousy, and obsession had been building inside her, and now it was ready to explode. When Greg saw her, he was confused and uneasy. He hadn't invited her over, and after everything that had happened between them, he had every reason to be cautious. But he had no idea just how dangerous the moment was about to become. Inside the house, the situation escalated rapidly. Shayna suddenly snapped. Whatever fragile control she had left vanished in an instant. Fueled by rage and resentment, she launched into a violent attack. A knife flashed in her hand, and before Greg could react, she began stabbing him repeatedly. This wasn't a momentary loss of control, it was a full-blown frenzy. When people commit murders driven by jealousy or revenge, investigators often notice a specific pattern, an uncontrollable rage where the attacker keeps striking long after the victim is already helpless. In Greg's case, the attack was brutal and relentless. The person responsible clearly harbored deep hatred. But Shayna had made one critical mistake. She believed the house was empty except for her and Greg. In another room, however, there was a tiny witness, Karen's 5-year-old daughter. Terrified by the sounds of violence, the little girl realized something was terribly wrong. Alone and frightened, she did something incredibly brave. She picked up the phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher on the other end of the line could hear the fear in her voice as the child tried to explain what was happening. For the officers who later listened to the recording, it was one of the most heartbreaking calls they had ever heard. A small child describing a horrifying scene she barely understood. When police arrived at the house, they stepped into what investigators later described as a gruesome crime scene. Blood was everywhere, and the violence of the attack was immediately clear. Greg Whitmore had been stabbed over and over again. It was the kind of crime that detectives often associate with intense personal rage. Whoever committed the attack had not acted randomly. This was someone who hated their victim deeply. As officers began piecing together what happened, the suspect quickly became obvious. Just hours later, police received another call, this time from Shayna herself. Her voice sounded confused and disoriented. She claimed she didn't understand what had happened. Officers soon located her several miles away in a neighboring county. When they approached the vehicle, the evidence was impossible to ignore. She was covered in blood. Investigators described it as evidence literally dripping from her. Shayna appeared dazed and incoherent, but the forensic evidence told a clear story. DNA, blood patterns, and witness testimony all pointed directly to her. With overwhelming proof against her, the case moved quickly through the courts. Psychologists who later evaluated Shayna pointed to a long list of behavioral and emotional issues. Years of untreated mental instability, combined with heavy alcohol use and prescription drug abuse, had created a volatile mix. None of it excused the crime, but it helped explain how her life had spiraled so far out of control. In August 2004, Shayna Parkinson was found guilty of murder. The judge handed down a life sentence with a minimum of 27 years before she could even be considered for parole. For many who followed the case, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. Greg had survived a war overseas, yet the greatest danger he ever faced was inside his own home. Friends who knew him struggled to understand how such a tragedy could happen to someone so kind and devoted to his family. They remembered him as a man who loved his children deeply, someone who simply wanted peace in his life. Instead, his story became a chilling reminder of something many people overlook. Domestic violence can happen to anyone. It doesn't always look the way people expect, And sometimes the victims suffer in silence because they fear they won't be believed. And in Greg's case, that silence ended in the worst possible way. Stories like this force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most dangerous threats aren't strangers hiding in the dark. Sometimes they are the people who once promised to love us forever. If this case shocked you, let me ask you something. Do you think society takes male victims of domestic violence seriously enough? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you found this story gripping, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who enjoys true crime, and subscribe to the channel for more disturbing cases that reveal the dark side of human nature.